Welcome everyone to this new edition of Research Conversation, the webinar series of the Research Department at the French Agency for Development. Today we are going to talk about structural change and green growth in Colombia. And this research that we are presenting today is part of a broad research project on macroeconomic modeling of the ecological transition called GEM. GEM stands for General Monetary and Multisectoral Macrodynamics for the Ecological Shift. The GEM projects aim at contributing to national and international public policy dialogue around the transition to a low carbon and resilient economy. The projects developed by the GEM team use modeling to nourish and structure these dialogues, and each project aims at improving our understanding of the interactions between economic topics and socio-ecological ones, agronomy, hydrology, climatology, and so on. Each of the projects are constructed around two types of models, either the world model, which is a simple toy model, and then country models. And the project today is around Colombia. We have currently 6 current country projects in Brazil, Colombia, Ivory Coast, Morocco, Tunisia, and Vietnam. The GEM project in Colombia, which is supervising the work presented today, has started in 2018 and is developed in partnership with the National Department of Plan and DNP, the Finance Ministry, MHCP, and the National University of Bogota in Colombia. And the main objectives of the project is to understand the financial impact of the investment that would be needed to implement the national the NDC, the National Determined Contribution of Colombia, and on the other hand, understanding how the monetary, fiscal, and trade policies will be impacted by this investment. Today, we will talk about structural change in Colombia. So within this NDC analysis, we need to understand how structural dynamics will evolve. The low carbon transition, indeed, is a specific type of rapid structural change where low emissions industries grow and high emission industries decline due to deliberate policies, changing preferences, and technological change. Given the ambition of the nationally determined contribution in Colombia, it is interesting to perceive what are the opportunities and vulnerabilities related to the low carbon transition in the Colombian economy. This webinar will explore the structural change undergone by the Colombian economy between 2005 and 2014 by using structural decomposition analysis. We will answer the following questions. Has the loss of industry participation in the economy been due to outsourcing or offshoring? Is there a reprimarization or backward specialization of manufacturing? What can be the sectors to achieve higher sustainable economic growth? Before I introduce the speakers, some rules of the game. So you are allowed to either chat or ask questions. Please use the question tab if you have questions that you want the speakers or the people in the audio in the panel to respond. The chat is for more general discussion, and you can like questions so that they will go higher into the question that emerge. Now, let me introduce to you the different speakers today. So Gustavo Hernandez is a senior researcher in the Directorate of Economic Studies from the National Planning Department and an assistant professor from National University of Colombia. He holds an MA in economics from the CU Denver and National University of Colombia. His current expertise and interest lies on applied macroeconomics and computable general equilibrium models, besides the linkages between the environmental and economics. Santiago Barbosa is an economist also from Universidad del Rosario, holds a master's degree in economics from the University of Los Andes, and currently works as a researcher and advisor on the Directorate of Economic Studies at the National Planning Department of Colombia. His lines of research are macroeconomics, financial modeling, international trade, structural decomposition analysis, and sectoral energy demand. And finally, we'll have a discussion by Guillermo Magacho, who joined us a year and a half ago. He holds a PhD in land economy from the Cambridge University, and before joining the AFD was an economist at the Federation of Industries of the state of Sao Paulo in Brazil. His main work is on input-output analysis, dynamic macroeconomic models to identify systemic risks arising from intersectoral relationship. So now I will leave the room to Santiago Barbosa, who will present to us the research that on structural change and green growth in Colombia. Can we please have the slides? There we go. Santiago, the floor is yours.
Good morning to everyone. Good afternoon to people that are never used time use. Thanks for everyone for being here. And today, as Antoine was mentioning, we're going to talk about an exercise that was made to analyze structural change and green growth in Colombia between a period between 2005 and 2014. So first, well, this is the structure of the presentation. We're going to go through an introduction, then we're going to talk about the linkages and key sectors, SDA, that is structural decomposition analysis, the data that we used, and furthermore, we're going to go through the results to then talk about some final comments and some policy discussion that is going to be like the core of the presentation. So before beginning, we need to take into account some installed facts about the Colombian economy. There have been some structural shocks in the Colombian economy that are recognized. For an instance, between the period of 2000 and 2014, there was a sharp increase in commodities price, such as the ones from food, oil, metals, chemicals, and energy. So therefore, some of Colombian primary exports that are coal, oil, and some agricultural products grew significantly. This was good for the economy in terms of the income that we perceived. However, the manufacturing exports fell a lot. Since then, Colombia has had an average growth about 5.2% between 2002 and 2008, which then collapsed to 1.2 due to effects of the global crisis in 2009, the one of the subprimes. However, as we mentioned before, between 2010 and 2014, the Colombian economy managed to consolidate its growth with an average annual growth rate around 5%, taking into account the increase in the commodities prices, especially the one of oil. So with this in mind, we need to take into account, we needed to try to understand what results would these have in the Colombian economy. So we try to answer three questions. The first one is to understand if there is a loss of participation from the industry in the economy, and if it has been from outsourcing or offshoring of the production, and then if there is a reprimarization or a backward specialization in manufacturing. For instance, if there is a greater production of commodities than industrial goods with high value added. Then, after taking into account this, we are going to try to understand which sector could achieve a higher and more sustainable economic growth, because we now know that the economies tend to be more sustainable in the, well, they should try to be more sustainable regarding the growth, because we need to address other issues such as climate change. So going into the methodology, we are going to use two types of methodology for two different issues of the presentation. First, we are going, well, they are all based in input-output analysis, and the base of this exercise is that first we're going to make an analysis in the trend of the linkages between the sectors according to Rasmussen and Disenbacher linkages. They are two different methodologies, but they are both used. And the Hirschman sector classification. The idea from us to use these linkages is to see how mobile and how dynamic are the sectors through the years. Are they changing for good, for bad? Are they not changing? Which sectors are changing? And then after we understand which sectors are changing and which aren't, we are going to make a split of the structure of the economy into three components managed by final demand, technology, and import substitution. That is following the methodology proposed by Magacho, Macombi, and Guillermo in 2018. This in order to understand, well, if there is a sector that is moving a lot, that is really dynamic, we are going to understand why is it really dynamic, and also the other side of the coin. That is, if there is a sector that isn't moving a lot, we need to understand why it isn't moving a lot. So going to the linkages and key sectors, the base of the model is a Leontief input-output model that is just written as this, and where we are going to find that X is the total gross production vector, A is the technical coefficient matrix, where each element is the amount of input that a sector requires to produce a unit of product, and Y is the vector of final demand. This is going to give us one X, X, big X, that is going to be used as follows. We need to build 4 different matrices. First, we need to build the Leontief matrix. That is in the Leontief model, and then we're going to we need the technical coefficient matrix, and then we're going to use the Gauge model. Then in the Gauge model, we need to calculate 2 different matrices, the Gauge matrix and the Gauge inverse. That are calculus shown and that are going to be used for the forward linkages and backward linkages. So Then after we manage to calculate the matrix, especially the matrix M, we're going to do a normalization of the linkages, of the backward linkages and forward linkages. So before going furthermore, backward linkages are associated with the ones or the sectors that demand inputs from other sectors, while forward linkages are associated to the ones that supply inputs to other sectors. So taking this into account, we are going to go through the next part of the methodology, that is the sectoral classification. So we are going to have four different classifications that are key sectors, that are sectors that have high forward linkages, total forward linkages, high backward linkages. Then we are going to have strong backward linkages sectors that are just the ones that have high backward linkages but low forward linkages. Then the strong forward linkages that have strong, well, high forward linkages and low backward linkages. And then we are going to have sectors that are characterized as weak linkages or low linkages, that are sectors that don't have either high, that have low forward linkage and low backward linkages. So this is following the methodology from Miller and Blair that is proposed in 2009. And with this methodology, we are going to do the first part of the exercise. The second methodology is the structural decomposition analysis, SDA. And what we are going to find in this methodology is that it considers that the shift in the total output is going to depend on changes in final demand and intermediate consumption. This is the first approach that is made by Miller and Blair in 2009, but then following Magacho, Colombie, and Guillermo in 2018, these changes can be decomposed into intermediate consumption, into technical changes and substitution of imported goods. The part of intermediate consumption, the part that stays the same that as in Miller and Blair, is the one concerning final demand. Then basically, this is the model that we are going to use. It's a 2 different year model, the 0 and 1, and we are going to need just the production in the year T and T plus 1 or T minus 1, depending on how you see it. And we just need M, that is the matrix of direct and indirect requirements to produce 1 unit, the Leontief matrix that is calculated from the process of the linkages, and Y, that is the vector of final demand. Then we start iterating the equation, modifying it, making some factorization to achieve our final expression, also following the proposed by Magacho, Macambe, and Guillermo, that is the following. We are going to find that the change in the product can be decomposed in 3 different components that were the ones mentioned before. That is, that we can take to talk about a component about technological change, a component meant as a substitution of national inputs, and a last component concerning the final demand. These 3 components are going to complement the exercise made by linkages to understand what are the dynamics inside the sectors. Why are they driven? Why not? Why they increase? Why not? And all of that. Oh, or why they decrease, because that's also a possibility in the economy. Also, if you decide to stop backing one sector, it's going to decrease in its technological change, its final demand. It's going to tend to disappear. So now, taking into account and leaving aside the methodology, the data that we used is obtained from the supply and use tables to 61 sectors on a basis of the national accounts produced by the National Administrative Department of Statistics, that is DANE in Spanish, and we intend to use these changes in production value from 2005 to 2009 and 2014. Well, the period of time that it was chosen was based on the criteria of data availability, quality, and comparability, because maybe if we took some data outside of the sample would be problematic. So that's the reason we use this period of time. And all the data is managed as at current prices, including the value added. And then when we have the data as a row, we deflate them as proposed by Miller Blair with a double deflation. So mentioning this aside, we are now going to go through the results that are really specific. And first, we are going to talk about the linkages. So when we talk about the Spearman ranks correlation, we try to understand how dynamic has been the economy, in the sense that is there a really if we classify the sector from 1 to 61 as their high level of linkages or low level if there is a high dynamic in the ranking of the sector. For an instance, if there is a sector that was in 2005 at the 30th place, then it moves to the 15th place, and then for an instance in 2014, it's a sector that is key sector and is on the top of the list. So with this, we are going to try to understand in a simple way if there is a dynamic or if the economy simply stays the same and the sectors that are driving the economy are still in the top and the ones that are low linkages are in the bottom. So as the results show, when we try to understand from the backward linkages from 2010 to 2005, the structural economy is quite the same. It doesn't change a lot. It's like 90% the same. So we might understand that there are some changes inside the ranking, but there are not major changes. Then, when we move to compare 2005 and 2014, backward linkages, we're talking, the dynamic is quite the same. It changes, it's quite 85%, 86% the same. And that's something that shows us the second column that shows that between 2014 and 2010, the structure of production is 92% the similar. Then when we move to the forward linkages, we find quite a more dynamic results from 2010 to 2005. That is, well, we took that the economy in 2010 is at 85% the same, but in 2000, when we move then to 2014, the structure of the economy is quite the same as in 2010. So between 2005 and 2014, the change is quite not inexistent, but really low. That is the what shows the second the column of the table. That is that the economy between 2014 and 2010 was 91.93% of the same as in 2010. So taking this into account, we see that we start seeing that there is quite a little bit of dynamics in the economy as a whole. So we go inside each sector to try to understand what happens in each sector. So taking this into account, well, before going into the sectors, we are going to understand that how the sectors are going to be distributed into the levels of linkages that they have. For an instance, when we talk about backward linkages, we see that in 2005, that is the red line, the linkages were quite we have like a bimodal distribution when we have first like mean, and then we have in the really high backward linkage sectors little accumulation. However, if we start looking to the sectors in each of the lines, 2010 being the green one and 2014 being the blue one, we start seeing that the sectors are starting to move towards a mean that is lower than the mean that we had in 2005. Taking about the sector are maybe starting to lose some complexity. Talking about linkages, they are starting to have a lot of sectors are going to have more low linkages, seeing that in sectors that we used to have in 2010 and 2005 with high backward linkages in 2014 are inexistent. Moreover, if we look about after 2.5 level of linkages. So this is like a phenomenon that's helped us to understand why don't we see a really lot of dynamics in the sectors and in the rank that we showed, the Hirschman correlation rank that we showed in the last slide. When we move to the forward linkages start having the dynamic doesn't change at all. Well, not the dynamic does change, but the narrative is the same, because we see that in 2005 there was like a quite normal-ish distribution about the sectors in the forward linkages. But then as we start moving to more recent years, this distribution starts again moving towards an edge, moving towards a mean that is a lower mean. And then we have a couple of sectors that are going to be, uh, that stay with high forward linkages, but the common issue is that they are moving towards a mean that is lower, and that is quite the thing that we are trying to attack in this presentation. For an instance, we try to understand why these sectors are starting to have uh, less linkages, especially forward. So it might be that they are producing more final demand goods. Well, that's the issue. So then, if we try to understand from the economy as a whole that is there an structural change, the Spearman rank correlation and the ranking of forward and backward linkages is going to found us to show us that there are no major changes in the economic structure in a period of time of almost 10 years. Then the disembarker linkages show us a less dispersion but a higher concentrations towards the average. However, and this is the thing that we are going to try to understand going forward, is that there might be some kind of sectoral structural change that could be considered. For instance, those sectors that are still in the farther right part of the kernel distribution. So then we are going to try to work with this, and then, well, it's, yeah, there, to understand what we were mentioning, we are going to work as in the sector classification of the agriculture first. The agriculture is one sector that is maybe in line with the whole economy. It's a sector that has a really low mobility. It's not much dynamic. We don't have any key sectors that are going to highlight. So it's quite a sector that is interesting to understand because agriculture is really important for the Colombian economy, but they haven't been moving forward. And especially if we take into account the sector that is strong forward linkages, it has a strong forward linkage. That is the forest extraction is a sector that began with a higher strong forward linkage, and throughout the years it has been losing the level of linkage. Coffee is a low linkage sector, and its mobility uh, is really low. Livestock and production and products is maybe one of the few that stays in its beginning level. It's a strong backward linkage, but it's its beginning level, and well, other ones such as fishing are related, uh, zero mobility, and just other agricultural products are the ones that are starting to move to start forward linkages. But as it says, it's in the name, it's other agricultural products, so there might be a lot of products in there. So, talking about agricultural, it's dynamic, it's in line with the economy as a whole, and well, it's low dynamics. Then we move to mining. We move to mining, we have these commodities that in the moment, as a result of the increasing prices, were really good to the Colombian economy. However, we have, for an instance, coal, that is one of the main traditional exports from Colombia. Coal stays in a low linkage level. Non-metallic minerals stays at a same level. And then when we try to see metallic minerals, is one of the few that starts having really interesting dynamics. They start having a huge, greater strong forward linkages. But then we see the oil and natural gas as an extraction industry, as an input industry, that their relevance as a strong forward linkages is starting to move towards the left. So that means that they are losing some, they are supplying less than they were supplying before, and that is quite an interesting dynamic. So this sector is more dynamic, it's more interesting. However, it's more dynamic in a way that we shouldn't expect it to be, because we need to, well, when we try to talk about dynamic, we expect to be an increase or a better part of the sector, not a decrease. So then we go into one of the most dynamic sectors and one of the most interesting sectors that is going to be working this exercise, and is the one of agribusiness. That is one of the key sectors for the Colombian economy, and what we hope is going to be one of the key sectors going forward in the Colombian economy to be able to to make something more sustainable. For instance, when we talk about meat and fish, even though their dynamic is not that important, they still have a strong backward linkage, a really strong backward linkage. So that is a really interesting result because that is a sector that we are talking about. That we are talking that they demand a lot of sector of inputs from other sectors inside the economy. So thereof we can talk about there is a sector that might be interesting to analyze, to support, to or to take into account going forward. Also, we have the dairy products that same as the meat and fish. We don't have that much dynamic, but they are still a strong backward linkage. So when we have high levels in the beginning, we don't need to see that mobility or that dynamics. For instance, we have also some sectors that are well in the same level that they were, for instance, like beverage, cocoa, milling products. But then we find other interesting sector that is the one of sugar and panela. The one of sugar and panela was a sector that began in 2005, being a strong backward linkage sector. But then throughout the years, you can see the red dot is the 2005, yeah, the green triangle is 2010, and the blue square is 2015. In 2015, the sugar and panela sector is considered a key sector, and it's something that needs to be taken into account because, well, it's really important for us. It's an agricultural based sector. So we are start finding what we mentioned before that there might be some structural change in sectors. Then we have pro coffee products that, in line with the coffee sector, has quite the same dynamics. It's a low linkage sector. I believe, they work really endogamic. They work with each other. And then we have the more important sector here in agribusiness, and more important for maybe some people. And it's the one of oils, but not like refinery oils, but the animal and vegetable oils. That is a sector that, even though it loses some of its level of linkage going backward, it gained a lot going forward linkages. It's decreasing both levels from 2010 to 2015, but it's a sector that might be useful to work with. This is a sector that might be increasing due to giving the inputs. They don't produce some oils like biofuel, but they give the inputs to other sectors. So that it might be the reason why they have stronger forward linkages in 2015. So agribusiness is a sector that needs to be taken into account. Then when we go to natural resources intensive, we see that there is, for instance, sectors that are still in strong backward linkages, such as the furniture and non-metallic minerals. Maybe tobacco is quite on the edge. They are like in the limit between low linkages and strong backward linkages. We don't have any sector that is as only classified as a strong forward linkages, but we are going to have three sectors that are going to be classified as key sectors that are the one of wood production, edition, and paper and products. However, we try to see the graph, and we are going to see that the blue squares are, if we want to see it in a graphic way, are more going to the left than the red dots or red circles. So that means that even though they are still a key sector, they are losing their level of linkage. Therefore, these sectors might be not that interesting. Also, if we take into account that paper and products and edition, a lot of these sectors might be tending to disappear. So, or not disappear, but gain less participation in the production or the GDP of any country. Then we move to other sector that is quite relevant for the Colombian economy. That is the one of unskilled jobs, intensive jobs. So we're going to have, for example, leather products. That the leather products, again, we don't see that much of dynamics. We don't see that they move a lot, but they are already in a high level of strong backward linkage. So it's a sector that is really relevant. And if maybe policy is not trying to make them super key sectors, maybe we would try to keep them and protect them, and for them to don't lose this level of strong backward linkages, because as we mentioned before, a strong backward linkage sector is a sector that demands a lot of other sectors inside the economy. So these sectors tend uh, to drive the economy somehow. For in this classification, we are also going to find the clothing, the manufacture of the textiles. There are a lot of sectors that are there in the limit, but as I mentioned, these sectors that demand a lot of inputs inside the economy need to be uh, backed, because they are really important. I mean, if there is not a sector that demands that many products, the demanded sectors are going to start having issues, and they are going to maybe tend to have inconvenience with their productions. And then we have our key sector in this classification, that is the one of natural textiles, that it has lost quite a bit of its linkages going forward and backward, but it's still a key sector. So maybe it's a sector that might be interesting to attempt to rescue for to mention to it's a hard word, but maybe to rescue and to try to work with them. Then we move to other sector that is really relevant. This is maybe with agribusiness one of the most relevant, because this is a really dynamic sector that is the high technological intensive. This is also more than a dynamic sector. It's a sector that is really relevant. People tend to think that the economy should move towards a highly technological intensive productive sectors. So, as we mentioned before, for an instance, if we look at the oil refinery products, it has quite a increase a lot. It's forward linkage. That has to be related with two refineries that were built and finalized in the Colombian economy in the period of time that we are studying. We have also key sectors like the basic metallurgical products, rubber and plastic, and electric machinery. But then we have a couple of sectors that start losing their linkages, like the transport equipment. But then we understand that these sectors are more going to the classification of a strong forward linkage sector, meaning that they are used to supply these products that they produce, even though it's redundant. But this sector is one of the most dynamic, and it's one that is important to take into account. And then this is the sector that help us understand why in Colombia there is a chance, there is a window, in order for us to try to work with to think about green growth and structural change, going towards an economy that is more sustainable. Go thinking about green topics. Well, we have sectors that are really low mobility, like water, gas, and sewerage. But then we have electricity. Electricity is a sector that between this period of time has gained a lot of levels of linkages going forward and backward, meaning that they are demanding more and they are supplying more than they used to. This development of these sectors is maybe the founding stone of green growth transition to a more sustainable economy, to talk about an energetic transition, because if we don't have a strong electricity sector of production, we can't attempt to do all of this. Or well, we do kind with other kind of sectors, but in Colombia, electricity has been gaining a lot, and then and more going to the final of the presentation. We are going to talk about how clean is the energy matrix in Colombia. So this sector is going to be key, and is going to be really interesting to us to back our hypothesis or our idea of try to propose or make any noise about an energetic transition, for an instance. Then, well, we have the constructional civil work sector. This is a sector that, as we might think, it's a strong backward linkage sector. It demands a lot. It, however, it's quite this demands the same. or they might use a lot of import goods. So that's why there is a low mobility or quite non-dynamic in the sector. They are strong backward linkage. Then we have transport. Transport is actually quite dynamic, especially if we take into account the water transport. They still are a strong forward linkage, but their level of linkage is quite stronger. Then, well, there is auxiliary transport or air transport and land transport that are quite the same as the beginning of the sample. So it's a sector that might go in line again with the dynamics of the Colombian economy. And then we have the services sector. Services sector is quite also it's quite no, it's really dynamic, especially if we take into account the health sector. The health sector has increased both in a strong backward linkage and going forward linkages. It's still not quite a key sector, but it's also all not all sectors are meant to be key sectors. We also need some sectors that are and keeps being strong backward linkage. For instance, for the one that we mentioned, they tend to demand a lot from other sectors in the economy. uh, then if we go to the strong forward linkages, we are going to find, well, company services, financial services, and repairs. And then in the low linkage sectors, we are going to have quite a lot of sectors that are going to be in hands of the usually of the government, but then their structure isn't meant to be a strong forward, strong backward, or a key sector because they work different. But there are sectors that are really relevant. Also, financial services are services that are going to be in the future, or not so much in the future, but in the present and the future, that they are going to be moving a lot. They are going to be really dynamic, or we expect them to be really dynamic. So those sectors are going to be also key to understand or to take into account when we try to think about the forward going of the Colombian economy. So, finishing with this, we make the same question: is there a structural change? So the sexual relations decline usually in both cases in terms of inputs, supply that is calculated by the forward linkage, and the sexual demand relations that are captured by the backward linkage. However, manufacturing industries inside the manufacturing industries, there are sectors in which the linkages increase. That are the ones that we mentioned before. So there, the dynamics of the linkages show the sexual difference between the economic structure. We are going to have like sectors really high in the levels, but we are also going to have a key concentration and a huge concentration going to the mean. That is the dynamics that are the dynamics that we found in the kernel of dynamics. That is the like there is an economy that is going two ways. A couple of sectors are going to increase their linkages, are going to increase forward, backward, but then also a lot of sectors are going to go towards the mean, are going to lose their linkages. So understanding what has happened in the Colombian economy, we go to the structural decomposition analysis, where we are going to find that X, the change in X is the change in total production, change in A is what we are going to call change in the technological change. A sub M is going to be associated to the substitution of imports, and delta F is going to be the one associated to the final demand. So when we take into account as a whole the economy, we are going to find that many or a great deal of the changes that are going to happen that are not that happened in the economy, especially in production, are going to be driven by the final demand. The final demand being composed by the exports, consumption, investments, government consumption, and inventories. The However, when we go to take into a look into the technological change, we see that there are not much interesting changes in the economy as a whole. I'm talking this is the whole economy, taking into account last one each one specific sector. And when we take into a look also into the substitution of imports, it's not that relevant as the final demand. However, as the past exercise, we need to go to the sectoral dynamics to understand what is really happening in each sector, because to talk into a whole as an economy might be somewhat misleading. So, before going into the sectors, we need to take a look at equally as the economy as a whole. For instance, we see that technological change did not have a positive effect on the output. this also being related when we see the TPF in Colombia, uh, the total productivity of the factors in Colombia, it has been the changes has been about a 0.4% between 2005 and 2014. So the final demand growth have led actually to the change in output is mainly led by the final demand, and its impact was about 37.7% on the total output. The substitution between imported and domestic inputs slightly limited the growth of the product due to an increase in import coefficients, but is not that relevant. So therefore, changes in input coefficients given by the sum of the impact of the substitution of import goods have had limited effects on the output growth. I mean, if we talk as an economy as a whole, there haven't been a much the low dynamic in the economy and in the sectors is associated with the low changes in technological in their low technological changes and low substitution between import and domestic inputs. Therefore, when we try to take a look into the dynamics between sectoral dynamics, we're going to find that there are different dynamics. For instance, the agribusiness sector is one of the few that shows positive impacts in the structural in the technological change. Let me make a clarification here. When we talk about technological change, since we are talking about technical coefficients, we need to our when we talk about positive changes, we are going to see negative variations because we are as technical coefficients. When you need less of an input, you are going to be more you're technically being more productive because you need less of any inputs. So negative is positive in the technological change, and positive is negative. Taking this into account, we are going to see that agribusiness and utilities are two sectors that are going to that have had important changes in their technological coefficients. That is quite interesting and useful in the narrative that we are building because these sectors, as we mentioned in linkages, are relevant, are important, and are going to be maybe the ones that are going to be useful for the future. However, agricultural is still an important sector in the Colombian economy, and if we take into account that the technological change is quite less or quite low, we need to understand that it's a sector that needs to be also intervened or maybe taken into account forward going forward in order for us to make them more sustainable or more competitive because we need to take into account that the economy needs to be competitive in a quite globalized economy, and the solution for us is to start being able to be included in the commerce chains. Equally, well, when we talk about the final demand is going to have quite a relevant input. Uh, be relevant in all the sectors. All the sectors increase their final demand, and if we take into account also the level of the value that is at the right of the variation, that is the level associated to this variation, we can look that maybe like almost 100% of the change is going to be associated to the changes in final demand. Then this is when we take into account also when we make a zoom into the substitution between imported and domestic inputs, we can see that they are quite relevant, more relevant, especially between 2005 and 2010. That was a period in which the economy moved a lot. But then, well, especially making like a zoom to specific sectors, we find that agribusiness has a negative dynamic and agricultural also, but high technological intensive, that was another sector that was relevant, has a really an opposite dynamic. So then, with the results at a structural decomposition analysis, we can maybe talk about that at a sector level, services in the sector is the sector that has contributed the most with the growth of the product, and there are large effects of the composition of effects within the industrial sector, for instance, on skilled jobs intensive and natural resources industries. Uh, So then, taking this into account, when we do the structural composition of the industrial gross production between 2005 and 2014, for these sectors that are the ones that compose the industry, we found, well, what we've been talking about, agri-industry has a change in their technical coefficients that is relevant, but natural resources, unskilled jobs, and high technological intensive have, well, their technical coefficients has varied in a way that we shouldn't be expecting. There are changes that are important regarding the import substitution between, well, imported inputs and national, but the final demand, again, due to its participation on the whole production, is going to be the one that is going to quite lead the whole change. So if there is an increase in final demand, probably the changing product, despite the changes, low changes in technological coefficients and import substitution, is going to be really high. So then, taking all of the results into account, we are going to have two aspects, especially to consider, more that are more present. For instance, Colombia, as the results showed us, has had a slight weakening of the change, maybe not for an specific side. The lightening of the weakening of the change comes from the supply and the demand sides, and this is as a consequence of low productivity growth and high exposure to fluctuations in commodity prices. As we mentioned in the beginning of the economy, many of the traditional exports for Colombia were commodities such as oil, coal, coffee, that is an agricultural product, and nickel. And also, we need to take into account that the abrupt slowdown in the economy that was a consequence of COVID-19 can lead to these trends to deepen. So we were having like a slight change, a slight weakening of the change, but COVID-19 stopped the economy and really stopped the economy, which made some sectors be more affected than others. But it's still quite a different, difficult scenario. However, we like to think about this as an opportunity because since the country is going to try to, for a matter of speak, turn on the engines, strategic sectors that were mentioned throughout the presentation could be improved by deepening the linkages and attempting to make important technological changes. For instance, if we think and we see that oil, animal, and vegetable is a sector that can still be a key sector, we need to go there and try to make it, well, to not rescue them, but help them to be more stable. However, stability is not the main or the only issue in the economy nowadays. We also need to think that the economy needs to be environmentally sustainable, which is a necessity given to vulnerability that presents to climate change, especially agricultural sectors, agribusiness sectors are going to be really affected if we don't address a sustainable way of production. Therefore, as shown before, agribusiness, high tech, industrial goods, energy, and some types of services have a great potential to be in economic reactivation, especially energy, because if we try to make a more sustainable economy, we are going to need to connect agribusiness, high tech, to a more sustainable going through towards an energy production based economy. Then the sector has the most dynamic linkages and could be key sector for the economy. So the challenge, or one of the challenges, is going to be try to connect all these sectors between each other to make it well, stable and sustainable. However, we have an issue: is that in Colombia, despite the energy matrix being fairly clean, it's fairly clean because it's based on a hydroelectric plant with low greenhouse emissions. Its disadvantage is that it's a sector of sustainable production of energy that is really can be really affected by by the climate change, since it's hydropower. So then we should talk about mitigation actions, or more than mitigation, adaptation actions that are going to be make us able to switch from our to renewable energy sources. Because if we keep depending of hydropower, it's going to be quite hard to just depend on them. Ah, sorry. Then we're going to have, going now into the inside the Colombian economy, we're going to have, for instance, a couple of difficult issues to attack, but this is important to know that we need to attack them. For instance, if we see the agribusiness sector, agribusiness in the Colombian economy is one of the greatest generators of employment. It hires around 26.2% of the total employment. However, this sector has an input that is maybe mainly agricultural and livestock sectors, which are major generators of greenhouse effects. That is about 14.2% of the total. So this is quite a hard to attack because if I mean employment is really important in the economy, but this is a sector that produces a lot of greenhouse effects. So we need to attack this sector because, as we've been saying, agribusiness is one of the also sectors that we are going to consider a possible key sector in the future of the economy. So we need to. It might be stable, but we need to make it sustainable. Therefore, some adaptation strategies must be created in the productive process of the sector, especially in the part about agricultural and livestock sectors, transversal policies where improving or changes the productive process of their inputs. And then, besides all of this, growth of the sector helps to boost the hotel and restaurant sector, which is one of the sectors that mostly drives demand in the economy, especially in sectors or in regions of the economy that are not that uh, quite developed as a city. So, well, taking this into account, this is like what we've been working, what we need to attempt, what we try to address with the issue, give the tools to understand which sectors we need to work on, and well, thanks to everyone for your attention, your assistance, and then well, Antoine has the floor for the rest of the agenda. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Santiago. Thank you very much for your presentation. We will now directly turn to Guillermo Magacho for a short discussion of this presentation. And please don't hesitate to ask more questions in the question tabs, and we will answer them. I have seen that there's already two of them that we will answer afterwards, but don't hesitate to go further. Guillermo, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, are you listening to me? Hello?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, we are listening.
Okay, great. Yeah, first of all, I'd like to thank for the invitation for comment and thank you for this very interesting presentation. I think it's talking about like reprimarización, backward specialization. It's something that's very important as far as I understand. First, because okay, we're talking about the specific case of Colombia, but it's more. I think it's a general phenomenon. If you look at most of the developing countries and sub-Saharan Africa, if we think, for example, South Africa or even Latin America, it's something that happens with all these countries, and especially during the commodity booms. And also because this discussion brings a lot of interesting issues in terms of the long-term costs of this backward specialization. In terms of growth, is well established in the literature that how this reprimarización can damage growth. But also, if you think about income distribution, there are recent literature that discuss how this specialization goes completely against the distribution, because you are destroying the sectors that are more important to pay higher wages, to hire more people. And also in terms of sustainability, we're talking about like sectors that are extremely dependent on like fossil fuels. So it's definitely a very important topic. And the approach you bring is, it's also very interesting because discussing the substitution of imported inputs for the domestic inputs for imported inputs is something that's especially interesting for these countries because these developing countries, most of them in Latin America, you talk about Colombia, Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Mexico, South Africa as well, and so not necessarily Latin America. You're the last 30 years, 20 years, you're reversing an effort of like many decades during all this, I think at least from the 30s, these countries entered an industrialization process that was very strong to keep very complex systems of production, with very complex productive chains, producing inputs and everything. So when you look at this data, we see that they are being destroyed. When you're talking about substitution of important inputs, we're talking about like replacing what you have done for decades. In 10 years, you are destroying a great effort, and to rebuild it, it's very difficult. Like it's gonna take like more 50 years, maybe, or maybe never, we'll never have it again. And if you look, for example, the agro sector that you show the results on the substitution and technological change, most of the technological change, the gains in terms of technological change, didn't make the country grow because it was based on the substitution for important inputs. So I would say that this is something that's it's approach that I appreciate a lot, and I think it's very interesting. Thank you very much for that. And I will discuss a little bit on the macroeconomics behind these and the consequence for the economy in the long run, because if you think about this substitution or reduction in the linkages, and I believe that they are mainly led by costs. Like you have a overvalued currency, and firms will have a defensive strategy, and they have to do these, that they will replace the domestic inputs for imported inputs because it's much cheaper, because you're producing and using your resources, or you have the imported one, which is cheaper because you have an overvalued currency. So firms have to do this. They need to do this, otherwise they will not be able to compete domestically or even internationally. And this same thing happens in Asia. Asian countries have the same process. The only difference is that while the Asian countries were doing this to increase their participation in global value chains, what happened in these countries is that they are not increasing at all. They are just replacing the domestic inputs for imported inputs, but they are not exporting more. They are not absorbing more of the domestic demand. They are just, so you only have the bad part, let's say, of this substitution, because the idea of like, okay, what most of the Southeast Asian countries did, they did the same process, but they reduced the importance of domestic inputs, but they increased the exports, and the exports compensated for these losses that you have when you reduce the imported inputs. So in the Latin American countries, in South Africa, and other smaller sub-Saharan African countries, this was definitely not the case. If you look at data and you show the data here in terms of the importance of final demand and the imported substitutions, for especially for the most sophisticated sectors, high tech, medium tech, and even for those that employ the most, which is the labor intensive and skilled labor intensive sectors, which is, although they are not very complex, they are very important for hiring people, especially in developing countries. They are responsible for generating good jobs, at least not the best jobs because the wages are not so high, but at least you are not in an informal sector. You are working for fabrics, for like, so they have their importance. And what happened with this process, I would say that it's a new way of having like a new method, a new form of Dutch disease, because basically, because you have a commodity boom, exports, the price of exports increase a lot, and because especially these exports, the commodity exports, in the case of Colombia is oil, in the case of Argentina is agriculture products, Brazil is mining, Chile is mining, Brazil is mining agriculture and oil, to be fair. But this is another way, like it's a new form of the disease, because it's a disease that happens within the industries. So the industry, you are producing less and adding less value to the product that you are producing. You are becoming maquilas, which is definitely not a good strategy for this country. But this process also creates a trap, which makes them difficult to maintain in the long run, a process where you can grow based on natural resources. Why? Because when you have the commodity boom, they have overvaluation of currency, you have the substitution of domestic inputs for imported inputs, and you became dependent of these imported inputs. But when you have the reverse of the cycle and you have the commodity, the drop in price in commodities, which happens like 5 years ago, and we saw this in 2004. You finished your analysis in 2014. 2014 is a year where is the last year where, of the commodity boom. After that, like the price of ore dropped for 1/3 as the price from 2014 to 2016, I think. It drops 2/3, so it's like it becomes 1/3 of the price. So you had to sell 3 times more to get the same amount of currency. So it's completely like when you have these drop in commodity prices, the exchange rate devaluate. You have like most of these countries you see in South Africa, they run the Brazilian real, the Colombian peso, all these currencies, they devaluate a lot. And what happens with the countries that first, you have a high increase in the cost of production because now you depend on imported inputs. So if you depend on imported inputs and the exchange rate devaluates, your price of the cost of production increase a lot. So you have inflation. Inflation will increase, and now we are seeing how inflation can increase very fast in these economies. Second, you have the drop in domestic demand because domestic demand was mainly based on this boom of the cycle. You reduce access to credit, you reduce the access to external markets, so you have a drop in demand. So you have a crisis, unemployment rises a lot because of this, rose a lot actually, where I'm talking like what happens in theory, but we saw that it happened with these countries in the last 5 years. And someone will say, okay, but now we are going to enter in a new process where you're going to replace the imported inputs for domestic products again. But the thing is, most of these firms are completely dependent of international, the foreign credit. They because credit was cheaper at the time, and they create a structure of leverage where the foreign credit was very relevant. And then you have the depreciation of the currency, devaluation of the currency, let's say. And these firms become very, very dependent of this credit, and the price of the credit increases a lot. So you have a balance of payment crisis rather than balance of payment, like rather than exporting more, you're going to export less because most of the firms broke and they had to stop producing. And then this is interesting because what happened with the economy is that, okay, now they cannot use the devaluation for accessing external markets. So you have only the bad part of this. If you have this period of, if you use the boost period, not to invest in these manufacturing uses, but only to replace imported and domestic inputs for imported inputs. And this is what you showed that happened in Colombia, and most of the works that they did for most of Latin American countries and sub-Saharan African countries show that this is a general process. So I would say that this is a very interesting topic because it brings all this discussion on the sustainability of this growth process based on natural resource, and it's clearly not sustainable. And it's clearly not sustainable. You're now generating a lot of unemployment in these countries. These countries are facing balance of payment constraints, balance of payment crisis. The industries that were responsible for distributing income because they pay good wages are not there anymore. So the consequences are very interesting from the point of view of theoretical analysis, but not so good if you think about people who are losing jobs, people who are losing opportunities, and the difficulty that these countries will face to do to deliver the NDC, the national contributions for the Paris Agreement. So thank you very much for the presentation.
Thank you, Guillermo. Very important indeed to understand the macro dynamics behind this structural change. I don't know if Santiago wants to respond to Guillermo. There were no specific questions, so I don't know if you have any points
No,
to add.
maybe not as much a question, but I mean, but all of this stuff that Guillermo is mentioning is really important because we need to attack like a lot of different fronts because we can't live on like unprotected unemployment, but then we can't lose competitiveness, but then we can make it unsustainable, but then we can make it unstable. So it's like a lot of fronts that need to be attacked. Like maybe thinking about like the impossible triad that we mentioned in monetary policy. We are going not a triad, but like 10 different fronts that need to be attacked because there, as Guillermo was mentioning, we can't, for instance, make everything going toward the productivity because then we can, for instance, lose a lot of jobs. That in developing countries, it's a really delicate issue. So, I mean, I think that all of these exercises and all the macro dynamics behind need to be taken into account to try to make something improve in the future. Maybe not as much as we would want to, but any improve is going to be really important for the economy and can start like a snowball effect. That if a sector starts working on that, then the sectors that depend on it, and well, that's something that I believe it's going to be really useful and really important for the discussion because yes, as Guillermo was mentioning, we have like a lot of issues that need to be attended.
Yes, indeed, Santiago, and we haven't talked about biodiversity constraints yet, which will start
Exactly.
to add complexity to the complexity. I think this is one of the crucial messages from this presentation. Is it is indeed important to have a multifactorial vision of the sectors, understanding the different roles they provide to the economy in terms of job creation, in terms of imports, exports creation, fiscal stance, and so on and so forth. And it goes back to one of the questions that Anna David was asking, which is how do you mitigate the vision that you were given in terms of forward linkages and backward linkages, and can we add trade exposure or the dependence to the domestic market in this, and understand a bit further the role they can have in the economy in a transition dynamics. And just as a quick catch up here, we are going to present our work later on in November by Guillermo, where we actually start to try to introduce this analysis of looking at multi dimensions of the input-output sectors and trying to understand, okay, how do they provide vulnerability or actually resilience to economies depending on their CO2 intensity or something like that. So this is something we'll present in a month from now, but still, so the analysis here is very relevant. I don't know if you want to respond to Anda in any way.
Maybe there is in this moment I can think about how to include this exposure in the linkages sector. But when we talk about SDA, the structural decomposition analysis, there is a way to decompose the final demand in which composes investment consumption, government consumption, inventories, and exports. So when you can make that decomposition, you can understand which sector is more exposed or is more dependent on the export sector than other ones. So then the SDA can be furthermore, can be bigger the table, and you can understand which sector in the going forward is going to be more relevant. Talking about exports because there are sectors that are internal consumption driven, and that is also really useful to take into account. I mean, in linkages, I can think about somehow to include it and change the graphs but in SDA, there is a way to make this decomposition. We mentioned about final demand as a whole, but that the composition can be done, and the results they don't change, and the specific fact that as a change in the results, but they manage to give you an additional tool to take into account which sectors, how to treat each sector, because as you saw in the final demand of each sector, it's quite the relevant participation of the changes in production. So that might be my answer to that.
Thank you, Santiago. One more question from Gustavo Zarate, who was asking the question: why do we see an evolution of the forward linkages in the electricity? Is it a consequence of the transition in energy policy? And what is the electricity mix in Colombia? Gustavo already responded by the fact that indeed the mix in Colombia is quite clean, around 80%, and a good reason a good motivation behind the increase in forward linkages is coming from the fact that Colombia started to export electricity to neighboring countries, Panama and Peru. One point I wanted to highlight here, and I'm going to go back to the slides. When you were presenting the role, so we indeed saw that the fact that there was an increase in the forward linkages by the electricity. What is interesting to look at as well is when you look at the high-tech intensive sector, the electric machinery. Oops, sorry, I'm here.
Sorry,
The electric machinery is actually reducing. So it was a key sector at the beginning and is now only a strong backward linkage. So this shows that and given the importance of electrification in the low carbon transition, if Colombia wants to be able to benefit as well from the green growth or from the opportunities created by the low carbon transition, one is the electricity, which is already taking place, but two would be able to actually reverse this trend and see an increase in the electric machinery and develop a domestic value chain on electric goods, electric machinery. I think this, and it was the case. So it was the case that Colombia had the know-how and technology to do so. It's a matter of trying to revert the trend that we have seen in the data. I don't know if you want to respond to that or if it just.
I mean, that I believe what Gustavo told and what you told covers the extent of what explains the change in the linkages from that sector.
Okay, I don't see any more questions coming up in the chat or in the questions. So I don't know if the others want to add some comments, Gustavo or Guillermo, if you have any further comments that you want to make. Not necessarily. So I think we can stop here this structural this webinar series, this research conversation. I want to thank very much Santiago, Gustavo, and Guillermo for being here and presenting this work. We will keep on working on this, and hopefully we will have a working paper soon and have more comments on this. Thank you very much for you being here, and Santiago,
No,
Gustavo, and Guillermo again. Thanks.
Thanks to you for the invitation.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Bye then.
Okay. Thanks everyone. Goodbye.
Goodbye.